Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's program with the Cronkite School of Journalism. My name is Tina Waddington. I'm the Executive Director of the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations. We're Arizona's premier foreign relations group, and our mission is to grow Arizona's global prominence by providing forums that explore critical foreign policy issues and build enduring international connections. I always try to say that with one breath, and I don't succeed. We work really closely with ASU and in so many ways, and it's been really wonderful to build a relationship through Andres Martinez with the Cronkite School. And we're so thrilled for this evening's program, and it's my pleasure to bring up the Dean of the Cronkite School to introduce our program this evening. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Batento Batts, and I'm the Dean of the Walter Cronkite School, and I really want to welcome you into our space. You know, one of the wonderful things about our school is that we get to do such cool and impactful and important events such as this. And so I'm excited for this evening and all the information that will be shared in the dialogue. So, you know, as Tina mentioned, it's really a pleasure for the Cronkite School to collaborate with the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations, and we appreciate all the important work that you do connecting our community to the outside world. I also want to thank Dr. Juan Mundell, who directs our Cronkite Global Initiatives, and his team, Sonal Lal, who is part of that team, and the events team here at Cronkite, who helped to put events such as these together for us. This evening's conversation is a timely one in light of the important elections happening on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border this year. And here at Cronkite, we celebrate the work of courageous journalists everywhere who put a lot on the line to tirelessly inform voters on the issues that they care about. And of course, we are concerned about the special challenges that journalists face in Mexico in exercising this important democratic mission. I look forward to hearing more on this pressing concern from our esteemed speakers this evening. I will let Isabel formally introduce them, but I did want to express my appreciation before we get started to Alejandro, who hosted me for a delicious meal at his home in Mexico City almost 2 years ago now. And this was a partnership visit that we had with Cronkite Global and as part of our Symbiosis collaboration. We thank him and his fantastic team, and I also want to recognize Mia Armstrong, who is here somewhere in the back. Mia, there you are. See you. Thank you, Mia, for your hard work on behalf of this partnership between ASU and Mexico City. We are very proud of Mia as well because she is a graduate of the Cronkite School in the class of 2019. And we are very fortunate that she returned to work with us here at ASU after doing a Fulbright in Mexico. Okay, and now I will hand it off to Isabel Mayoga, our moderator for this evening. Isabel is the Senior Coordinator for Convergence for the Convergence Lab, CDMX, one of ASU's Mexico-based efforts. She is a native of Mexico City who at a very young age had the exotic international experience of coming to Phoenix to work at the Mexican consulate here. From there, she went back to Mexico and worked at the UNESCO mission and Mexico's Council on Foreign Relations before going to Washington to obtain a master's degree in American foreign policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Upon graduating, she worked as the stakeholder manager at the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and then came to join us here at ASU in 2022. Isabel, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Dean Batts. Thanks so much to Tina for being such a great partner. And thank you all for coming here tonight. As Dean Batts mentioned, I coordinate Convergence Lab. It is a project from ASU that seeks to connect the university with Mexican audiences and partners to explore ideas of mutual interest. And one of our favorite partners is Gato Pardo, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Alejandro Legorreta. He's a businessman, a philanthropist, and a social entrepreneur. Among many things, he is the CEO and chairman of Sabino Capital and Acacia Capital, a Mexican private research and investment group. And with his wife, he leads the Fundación Legorreta Hernández, a nonprofit organization that promotes social and economic development in marginalized communities in Mexico. And of course, he's the chairman of Gato Pardo. We also are joined by another great friend of ASU, Ambassador John Philly. He's executive director for the Center for Media Integrity of the Americas, an initiative that actually was launched at the ASU California Center during the International Media Summit of the Americas. And he has a 28-year career at the State Department, among many other things. He was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, and U.S. Ambassador to Panama. So welcome. And to start this conversation with such a provocative title, The Existential Struggle for Mexico's Democracy, first I want to acknowledge that democracy in Mexico has come a long way. A quick refresher for those who don't know, Mexico was ruled 70 years by the same party, the authoritarian PRI. And in the year 2000, for the first time, we had true democratic elections. And the candidate of the opposition became president. At the time, Julia Preston, who was a New York Times correspondent in Mexico City, she wrote, "Mexico turns into a self-confident democracy, whose voters are capable of ousting a government, no matter how dominant." And it feels like Mexico continue to feel confident about their democracy. The INE, the National Instituto Nacional Electoral, is the agency that coordinates and oversees the elections. It has a good reputation among the population. It is the third most trusted organization just after public universities and the army. And in the last presidential election in 2018, the participation rate was about 63%. So it seems that democracy in Mexico is going well. However, despite having elections every 6 years, key players in Mexico democracy find themselves threatened, under pressure, and in a vulnerable situation. I'm talking about journalists, I'm talking about environmental watchdogs, and I'm talking about human rights activists. Civil society in general, but also institutions like the CIDE, the INAI, that is the agency that grants access to public information, and they provide checks and balances. So I want to start this conversation by asking both of you, tell us about your organizations and how your efforts are addressing these vulnerabilities in Mexico's democracy. So Alejandro, tell us about Gato Pardo and why you're so invested in journalism.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all this wonderful team. For me, it's a pleasure to be, no doubt, in the best university in Arizona and one of the top of the United States. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much. And to share this space with Ambassador, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Well, the truth is that just in a quick response, I decided to invest in journalism. First, because I wanna put in service in a smart and efficient way my privilege, and I think this was a really important way to do it. Second, because I'm totally convinced that journalism is one of the most important ingredients for democracies and also for social justice. So that was the second reason. And the third reason was because Gato Pardo is the most respectful, slow journalism platform in Latin America. So those three things make all the sense to get involved in journalism, and I think in a moment that it's more crucial than ever, in which our democracies are in a danger because of this virus called populism and the post-era that we're living. So that will be like the quick response of why I started to invest in journalism.
Thank you. John, the same question. Tell us about the Center for Media Integrity and why you decided to invest in this project.
Sure. So the Center for Media Integrity is a very small civil society organization. I and others started it because having spent 28 years as a participant in journalism, primarily as a source, as somebody who spoke officially for the US government, who needed journalists and journalism to get the government's message out, to explain our policies, I recognized the important symbiosis between government and journalism. I also, when I left government, went to work for Univision, and I spent a couple of years as a commentator on Latin American politics, US foreign policy in Latin America. And I began to see sort of firsthand the multiple crises facing journalism. Everything from business models to digitalization to multiple platforms to reader and public attention being shortened and the bombardment of information that goes out, often which is purposeful disinformation. So coming out of sort of COVID, we all kind of retreated into our bubbles, and I was thinking, how can I combine sort of, what I know and what I feel comfortable talking about and investigating further, U.S. hemispheric relations and journalism. And so the short answer is that I found there were a lot of really, really outstanding journalists who were looking to collaborate in a space that would do that and at the same time serve a purpose. And the purpose is to kind of do the follow-on work to the Cronkite School. Cronkite School produces journalists. Nobody does continuing education for journalists. And nobody does continuing education in Latin America and the Caribbean for journalists. So with all of the breakneck vanguard technology that's coming out, the way in which people are using social media to tell stories, the way in which people have to use data and the whole concept. 15, 20 years ago, nobody talked about a data journalist. What does it mean to be a data-driven journalist? Well, now that's kind of the bread and butter. And so you have people all over Latin America and the Caribbean who are journalists who want to tell these good stories and don't have the skills and can't go back to school. So we provide a place where they can sharpen those skills and hopefully continue to tell good and honest and ethical stories in the service of good journalism and in the service of supporting democracy.
Thank you so much. Let's start talking about the macro level. Alejandro, what is your general assessment about the situation in Mexico? Do you see the glass half empty, half full? Are you feeling optimistic or negative?
I see the glass totally full. It's totally full as a potential, and the glass is also fragile, in which it's being attacked by external and internal problems. Maybe the external ones are the ones that you also have here, which is the post-truth and the populism and all those type of things that are a huge challenge in Mexico. And maybe the most important challenge in Mexico internally, it's security. But those things, I think eventually, I am very positive about Mexico because we have three things: our location, the size of the population, and the culture. With those three things, being a smart partner and neighbor with the states, and with the change that we're seeing in the geopolitical point of view, if we get to know how to be better partners between the states and Mexico, I think we can create by far the most powerful joint venture between the Americas, that it's going to be difficult for China and another block of countries to be more powerful. But we have to understand how useful is this partnership, and I think we haven't understood it.
And what do you think it's missing for us and the US to understand the potential of the partnership?
I think we have to understand our strength and our weak. Because both countries have strength and have weak. But now with this change, we're also seeing a new player in the geopolitical issue, which is the businessman. If you take in count the market cap of the 7 most important companies in the technology area, they're the equivalent of the GDP, taking out the states, of the whole continent. Or if you see it in another way, the cash available of the 3 most important companies of technology, which is basically Microsoft, Alphabet, and well, you take also Tesla and NVIDIA, they will have more cash than 90% of the countries in the world. They have a $500 billion cash in their pockets, and just to give you an idea, the Ukraine war, it's around 5 to 10 billion per month. So that's the capacity of those companies. And that's another really important player in this change of geopolitical change. So I think all that together, it's a great opportunity for Mexico and for the States to understand how important it is to be a better partners.
Yeah. John, this is an electoral year in both countries, but what are you following very closely about the election in Mexico?
You know, I was really fortunate to be in Mexico and work at the American Embassy during Vicente Fox, as Isabel said. He was the first democratically elected president in the year 2000. And I look back on that time almost as like a golden era, the excitement that existed. People might not remember, but in, excuse me, in that year, George Bush made a visit to Mexico. The very traditionally, American presidents always meet first with the Canadian Prime Minister. So we have this concept of North America, Canada, United States, Mexico. He broke with that tradition. He's a Southern governor, he was a Texas governor, as you know, and we had this moment. And I can tell you that all of us, from the ambassador on down to, you know, everybody in the Department of State, we felt like this was going to be the moment. And on September 7th, Vicente Fox of 2001, Vicente Fox addressed the joint Senate and Congress of the United States, or joint Senate and House of the United States, which is an honor that is not very frequently given to a visiting head of government or head of state. And 4 days later, we were attacked on 9/11. And I have to tell you that, you know, I don't want to sound like an old man sort of reminiscing, but it was as though we watched our focus go away. I come from New York. When I was a kid, we were joking last night, I grew up in New York City as a kid. I didn't know a Mexican. I never thought about Mexico. When I was told over there or out there or another country, I immediately thought of Europe. It wasn't until much later in my life when I had become a diplomat and had worked in Latin America, and my very first experience with Mexico was in that year, 2000. And I know that it may be a little bit personal, lo llevo en la piel, whatever the question may be, but we lost focus as an American nation on the importance and the potential of Mexico as our closest partner. Now, we have, you asked the question, what's the glass look like, half full, half empty, right? If we think of the liquid in the glass as the Mexican population, that's full and brimming, amazing potential. We have a glass that is actually very well structured, given a lot of work over many years. We have the USMCA, we have a trade agreement, we have incredible, I don't need to tell people in Arizona how incredibly integrated our economies are. But we still, sadly, have a relationship that very frequently is characterized not by love-hate, right? People always sort of jump to that and say, oh, U.S.-Mexico, you're always fighting over the border, or whatnot. It's not love-hate. It tends to be, in my view, obsession and indifference. Mexicans tend to be obsessed looking northward, whereas most Americans tend to be indifferent looking south. They think of Mexico and they think of Cancun and the stereotypes and spring break, or, you know, can you get avocados for the Super Bowl, or, you know, we need to, and I think this is going to be an excellent year to do that, the combined electoral year. We need to generate in the United States, more broadly, a greater awareness of the potential. And we need, as official, and I say I'm now retired, so I don't speak for the U.S. government, but in the U.S. government and in officialdom, we need to begin to change the lens. We tend to look, historically, we have looked at Mexico through a threat lens. Bad things come from Mexico, whether it's drugs, whether it's unregulated migration, whatever the case may be, whether it's corruption on a grand scale. You know, we just saw in the New York Times a story about, a non-story, quite frankly, about the Mexican president. We need to begin to look, and when I say we, I mean people like my family, New Yorkers who really don't speak Spanish, who don't know Mexico, who aren't physically close to it, who don't know what Mexicans are about, and who live in a world of stereotypes, need to change the lens and look at Mexico through an opportunity lens where both of our nations, along with our northern partners in Canada, can turn what is already, it is already the most dynamic economic integrated market in the world, but there is so much more that can be done.
Yeah, and we talk about Mexico now, let's move back to Arizona, and the audience here, they're very familiar with this narrative about the importance of Mexico as a trade partner and the importance of collaborating with Sonora and with all the border states and explore the potential for further economic integration. But I want to ask you both, do you think Arizonans should be worried about the situation in Mexico, the setbacks in democracy, and how that is going to impact the trade with the country?
You know, I think there is reason to be concerned about the state of Mexican democracy. You mentioned a few things. Their equivalent of the Federal Election Commission, the INE. I remember the line we used to use in the embassy was, we're going to wrap ourselves in the INE. Because, you know, Mexicans are famously anti-imperialist, or they don't want the Americans, you know, the line always is, you know, gringo metiche, you know, stay out, non-intervention, right, in the internal affairs of Mexico. And so our line back then was, my God, they've done this on their own. The United States didn't set up INE. The UN didn't set up INE. Mexicans set up INE. And INE has been an amazing electoral institution. It's world class. They've literally sent their election monitors around the hemisphere. And our line back then in 2000 was, we're going to wrap ourselves in this thing, and we're going to stay away, keep our hands off, and let Mexicans prove to the world that they are capable of holding a free, fair, transparent election that reflects the popular will of the people. And that's why I say it was an enormously exciting time. Fast forward 24 years, where are we? I think that the electoral institution is under great stress. I think the current president has gone out of his way purposely to weaken it for obvious populist reasons. I am very concerned about the state of journalists in Mexico. Mexico is among the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists to work. Over 20 journalists died in 2022, assassinated, killed by any number of actors, almost certainly most of them associated with organized crime. I think that the concern about the IFAI, which is an institution, many may not know what it is, but you know, in the United States we have FOIA regulations, right, where you can go out, Freedom of Information Act, and a citizen, a journalist, can petition to have information declassified or released to the public so that you understand what your government's doing. Mexico actually did that, set up something called the IFAI. The current government has kept it from functioning. They've done it in a very subtle way. They haven't named counselors to it. So decisions get taken by a consensus of 7 counselors. I think a quorum is 5. They've only got 4 counselors. So that way, nothing gets released. All the requests for information get backed up. These are the limbic system. This is the lifeblood of a democracy. And I think it's fair to say that the institutions are under great stress. Now, at the same time, I think you have to look at the other side. Look at these marches. I don't know if people saw, but how many people did you have? 400,000 in the Zócalo about a week and a half ago, 350, 400, something like that. I mean, that's one thing about Mexicans. They know how to do a street protest. They're better than anybody I've ever seen at that. And what were they out there for? They're out there protesting. Now, you could say that a lot of these people were sort of urged to go out, buy T-shirts or food, what they call a despensa. But my read of it is, no, there were legitimately a lot of people who are very concerned that the current government is attempting to repress genuine democratic expression, whether it is through the vote, whether it is through the free and fair exercise of journalism, whether it is through just simply being informed about who's on the ballot. So I think we're at a moment I think this year will be an inflection point for Mexican democracy. I think generally we only see inflection points in the rearview mirror. I think this one we can see coming, and my great hope is that the Mexican people themselves can make an election work, make it be free and fair, and begin to back off the government pressure on these institutions.
And now that you mentioned violence against journalists, and we're in a journalism school, I have to ask, Alejandro, do you want to provide some context about this situation in Mexico? Who are the journalists that are targeted? Why? And does that mean that there's no investigative journalism in Mexico?
Well, yes, as Ambassador was saying, in the last year, well, in this administration, around 30-something or 40 journalists have been killed, and maybe in the last 15, 20 years, around 200. It's in some areas of Mexico, it's really, really dangerous to make journalists. And again, Mexico, it's a place full of contrast, because as you can have in the Yucatan Peninsula the same homicide rate as in Luxembourg, really, really safe, you can have one of the most dangerous cities in the world nearing the frontier. So it all depends in the area of Mexico where you are or what you are also investigating. So it's been really tough in the last years to help reporters to make their work. One of our also a really good friend of us, and she's a part of the board of directors of Gato Pardo, Lidia Cacho. She found like 10 years ago this network of child abuse, sex child abuse near Cancun, and one of the supporters of that network was a governor of Mexico. And because of that investigate journalism, both of them, a business guy and the governor, went to jail. And it was a really important piece that helped take down that network, which, by the way, it's one of the, Indonesia and Mexico are one of the top 2 places to do that in the world. Now she's living in Spain because she cannot go to Mexico because she has already some attempts to kill her. So maybe that's a reflect of how dangerous it is and how important and how good is investigate journalism in Mexico, because it's a lot, and it's a lot going on. We support a lot of that, but a lot of the times not with the brand of Gato Pardo, because then I will put in a lot of risk the company. So you have to be really strategic how to do it, with whom you're going to do it, and to take it out in the best time also.
Yeah, and John, what about the role of foreign correspondents, in particular American correspondents, in Mexico conducting investigations that are pretty uncomfortable for the government. We had this shocking news this morning with the New York Times, but I'm thinking about the investigation also by the New York Times about the metro that collapsed in Mexico City, and it was the most comprehensive investigation that was done. Not even the authorities did such a detailed job. So how are foreign correspondents and their investigations kind of being at the counterbalance of the official version of things? Yeah.
You know, being an American journalist overseas is very frequently an enormously privileged position. As I'm sure all of you know, major media companies used to have people all over. And so in any city overseas, you would find 7 to 8 U.S. newspapers, foreign broadcasts, or broadcast television would have people overseas. Those numbers have fallen, and it's simply a function of cost. And so foreign bureaus, as they're called, tend to be much reduced today. But I would still say that when you have an American journalist who is investigating something, he or she really can't do anything without locals. And so those investigations that may be published in the New York Times about the Metro, I can tell you that they were done in part by Mexicans. And this is the same all over the world. And I actually think it's one of the great strengths of American journalism that it can kind of provide a cover. Now, obviously, you have to be very careful to make sure that it's not done with a particular bias or with, you know, that you've gone into this investigation with a view to weakening a government because you don't like it. But if you do what investigative journalism is supposed to do, which is follow the facts and tell the story. As Alejandro just said, if you're living in Mexico right now and you do that and you're a Mexican, it's a dangerous business. People die on a routine basis. Families are threatened on a routine basis. So if you can do it in conjunction with an international media, and the Americans aren't the only ones. I mean, you know, you've got BBC that's there, but that takes a tremendous amount of A, money, B, infrastructure, and C, commitment to tell those stories. Now, why did the New York Times tell that story? And that's an interesting thing that I think speaks to the greater presence of Mexico and Mexicans in the American mindset. Mexicans are the largest they are the largest group of migrants to the United States. We have massive numbers of people who are second and third generation Mexicans. And so what happens in Mexico City actually affects more Americans today than would have been the case 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so I think that's actually a great example of the integration. Why the editorial staff at the New York Times thought that what's a strictly local investigation, right? If a bus crashes in San Diego, do you guys care? No, it doesn't affect your daily life. So why did they care about it? Well, because of the broader story that it told. It told a story of massive corruption. It told a story of patronage. It told a story of completely insufficient materials, and ultimately tragic results.
Yeah. And before we end this conversation, I want to turn this conference into a therapy session for you. So Alejandro, tell me what frustrates you about how the U.S. views Mexico and how the U.S. covers news about Mexico.
Well,
La verdad.
It's sad when you realize that some Americans only see Mexico as gangs, tequila, tacos, and
sombreros.
And that's the truth. And maybe, for sure, we have been lacking in our policies for soft power. America is the king of that. That's why everybody loves Hollywood. Everybody loves Coke and the American dream that has already impacted the whole world. In Mexico, I think we've been lacking for that. When we were signing the NAFTA, the first NAFTA, one of the strategic movements that the government of Mexico did was to start showing Diego Rivera and some of the most important artists in Mexico in the most important museums in the States. So they could start changing the mind of the congressman and the American people, the way they were looking to Mexico. And I think in Mexico, we've been lacking a lot about that. We have maybe one of the top 3 type of architecture in Mexico. Legorreta is one of them, and some others architects, and also movies that are being doing, obviously gastronomy, and still, not all, but a lot of Americans still see Mexico as gangs and tacos and tequila. But we're also very powerful in a lot of things. We have the biggest bread company in the world. We have one of the top 3 cinemas companies in the world. Obviously, by far, the biggest tequila company in the world. And some other things, so many things that still we haven't understand how to communicate. So I think it's not the fault of the Americans. I think it's mostly fault of the Mexicans that we haven't understand how to communicate that.
Yeah, we need to have a better narrative about our own country. John, you spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and I think we share this frustration, how little attention Mexico deserves among policymakers in D.C. What frustrates you about the situation that this whole election in the U.S. and apparently all of Washington's foreign policy is about the border and what it means Mexico right now?
Well, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, my biggest frustration is this insistence that we look at Mexico through the lens of a threat. We want to, we look at that border as a place to stop threats. And yet the reality is that Mexico is our top trading partner. The reality is that every American, whether he or she realizes it, benefits enormously from that border. And we have a vested self-interest in making that border a even more cohesive area. The other thing that I think frustrates me is part of our soft power. The soft power of Hollywood, the soft power of television, has an undeniable, enduring influence. So when you think about what are the stories that Hollywood tells about Mexicans, they tend to be about drugs and thugs, about tequila, about desperados. I mean, we have not done a very good job of, I think, Americans in general and the government in particular, of showing the United States just what an amazing place Mexico is. Now, I'm not here to do an ad for Mexico, but as an American who served there twice, who spent a lot of time, a friend of mine, I think I told you earlier today, a friend of mine once said to me, John, if soft power really mattered, Mexico would be on the Security Council at the UN. And it's really true. But Americans, because we have a history of great amalgamation, let's say, and our ability, you know, we used to call the melting pot, our ability to rub off the cultural edges of previous generations of migrants, we tend to have this sense that every generation of migrants that comes is going to be like our grandparents, right? So the people who first came, yeah, they may speak the old country language, but by the second generation, we're all Americans. Well, there are two things that make that fundamentally not true today. One is the jet engine, and two is telecommunications. So when my grandparents came, right, my grandfather didn't go back to Italy for over 60 years. He had his entire life lived as an American, and he didn't go back because you just didn't. Now, because of technology, because of, in the case of Mexico, proximity, you can not only go back, but you can live a full life as a Mexican, an American, a Mexican-American, and it is my greatest hope that one day we can sort of get rid of the hyphen in there, and the American bureaucracy will be far more better educated as to the great potential that's in Mexico. I mean, let's face it, lithium and solar, those two fundamental sources of the world's future. We're going to need solar energy, or we're going to end up in a cataclysmic melting ball, right? So we've got to transition to solar energy somehow, along with other renewables, and lithium. And Mexico is sitting on top of tremendous amounts of it. How are we going to take advantage of that? How are we going to take advantage so that it is to the mutual advantage of both Mexicans and not just an extractive exercise where the U.S. takes it and does what it wants with it?
And we don't have much time left, but I just want to remind the audience, if someone wants to ask a question, please come to the microphone and we will proceed with the Q&A. My final question for you, Alejandro, what is keeping you up at night?
12 years ago, we invited the Secretary of Treasury, Hank Paulson, to Mexico to make a conference, to make a speak in a conference that we organized called Value Investing Forum, to share his ideas. This was after the financial crisis. And it was like 1 year later of that. And I remember taking a coffee with him, and I asked him that. How come you can sleep during those months in which you have the responsibility to decide which bank and which country will go bankrupt and which one not? And he's one of the smartest guys I have ever met. And he told me, well, one thing that I'm totally convinced is that I need to have, when you're a decision maker, you need to have a really fresh and sharp mind to take good decisions. So because of that, even at the worst moments, I think it was only like 2 times he kept sleeping at his office. But the rest of the nights, he said, I realized there was a moment that I couldn't do anymore, and that it was much more important to go back to my home, kiss my wife, and go to sleep early, because I was going to wake up really early to start making sharp decisions again. I remember after that meeting, when I was taking a coffee with him, I changed totally my set of mind. And I decided that I was going to try to replicate that, because if a size of that guy could do that with those type of responsibilities, I realized that if I want to keep being useful in the finance business and in the journalism business, mostly with all the things that are going on in the world, is that I will have to follow that philosophy. So having said that, I really use my nights to feel love and sleep, and that's all the things that I do. And I always sleep at least 8 hours per night. That's like, I meditate once I wake up, and once I meditate, the first thought, usually when we're talking about this type of issues, my first concern, it's always global warming. Because I'm also convinced that it's going to be the most radical accelerator of inequality and poverty in the world in our lifetime. And that will increase the stress of societies, and that will increase the stress and resources of governments, and that will increase the possibility of populism, of gobiernos autócratas, how do you say it?
Autocratic government.
Because people are going to be desesperated for solutions, for quick solutions, and that's going to be the spin of the things that we might have to live. So that's always my first concern, but that happens when I wake up, not before.
Very smart. What about you, John? What is keeping you up?
Well, I'm a lot older than Alejandro, and so at my age, what keeps me up at night is my bladder. But aside from that, when I think about Mexico, what I do worry about with regards to the U.S.-Mexico relationship is the next surprise. You know, I mentioned earlier 9/11, right? I really thought we had an opportunity to take the relationship to the next qualitative level, and the simple fact is the United States took its eye off the ball. Now, you can go back, and I'll leave it to historians to decide whether it was right or wrong, but we focused on, you know, the global war on terror. But if you go back and you look at the last 60, 70, 80 years of U.S.-Mexican history, actually you go back even further, both sides, in both capitals, let's say, we live in fear of what I used to joke in Mexico, la próxima emboscada, the next sort of, how do we say emboscada? Ambush, the next ambush. So when Mexicans, whether it's security officials or economic officials, when they come to the table to sit down and speak with their American counterparts, they're always worried in the back of their head that the Americans are going to do something unilaterally and not tell them. And there's going to be a surprise, and the surprise is not going to be pleasant. And conversely, when Americans come to the table and sit down, and this is particularly true in the security area or in the migration area, they're always afraid that the individual sitting in front of them or the institution that they lead is going to be corrupt. And we're going to find out that están en la nómina del Chapo, right? They're on Chapo's payroll. That's, you know, that was the Garcia Luna case. And so and like with depressing regularity, we kind of fulfill the other's worst dreams. So if you take a look at the General Cienfuegos case, this was the former Mexican Secretary of Defense. He was nabbed in San Diego. Nobody in the American government other than DEA knew about it, and there was no heads up to the Mexican government. And this is independent of my sense as to whether or not he was guilty, should have been grabbed, shouldn't have been grabbed. But friends don't treat friends that way. That's a mistake. You have to understand that you build confidence by showing measures of trust. And the simple fact is that when we sit down and we talk about, and you're reading now, if you follow U.S.-Mexico issues, the fentanyl discussions, right? We've finally begun to pay attention because now the latest threat to come from Mexico is fentanyl in the United States. But you build trust over time, you build trust by extending trust, and I think we consistently fail at that. And so what keeps me up when I think about the U.S.-Mexico relationship is I'm waiting for the next time we fulfill each other's prophecy and the gringos do something that they don't tell the Mexicans about, that embarrasses them, or that they think violates their sovereignty, or the next time the Mexicans end up having their top cop on the payroll of the world's biggest narco trafficker. And I hope that we can overcome that, but it's going to be hard.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now it's time for Q&A.
Maybe picking up on the theme of surprises, just to come back to the democracy theme, let's set aside the United States elections. Looking at Mexico on June 2nd, should we expect some surprises? And plus you have the whole history of AMLO and some of his, let's put it this way, anti-democratic actions that you've touched on. I wonder if you all could talk about that a little bit.
Well, maybe this is not a very political answer to give, but I am not that worried about the results of the next election. There's a lot of reasons why I think like that. First of all, because that doesn't mean I want that or not, but if there's no surprise, the candidate of the government is going to win, and if there's no surprise, she's going to win because they have the federal government, because the president is really popular. He's one of the top three more popular presidents in the world, because he have this morning show daily, so he's communicating daily about all these things, because they govern 65% of the states in Mexico, in the local places, and because of the social programs that he started, they're gonna give away around 25 or $20 billion this year in different programs. For people who are 65 or older, they're gonna give money. For students, they're gonna give money. For people who want to put some nice trees in the garden, they're gonna give money. So when you have all those type of things and he's popular, and we're not in an economical crisis because the finances of Mexico are quite well, seems like when some people said, well, maybe the other one is gonna win, it's why she's gonna win? I mean, I'm not saying I want one or another, because I prefer to be outside that discussion, but I really believe in data and in evidence. So once I have read all that, it's like, so I think that will give type of a stability to say it's difficult to have a surprise there. Now, the other thing is, are they going to have majority or not in the Congress? I will get worried about that if they have absolute majority, because I don't want even absolute majority to my wife. When somebody have full power, even if she's or he is the nicest person in the world, it's dangerous, and it's important to have a balance of power everywhere in everything. So that's maybe a little bit more scary. And then Mexico City, which is like the second most important election after the presidential, then the coin is already in the air, and we don't know what's going to happen, because half of the territory it's in the opposition and half of the territory it's in Morena. So I'm not that worried about that. And the second main reason for that is that, okay, now what's the profile of the candidate that it's winning in the polls now? Well, she's technical. She's really technical, and I know a lot of people who works with her, and she takes decisions with evidence. She's famous of asking to show the Excel in the computer to justify a decision. So that's a totally different type of decision making than the actual government. And Mexico City, it's going quite well, and she has been doing her work in the last 5 years. That doesn't mean that I'm going to vote for her or not, but that's, again, just evidence, no? So I don't think it's going to be like as dramatic. There's some people in the opposition saying this is going to be like the last time we're going to see this. We have been seeing the ending of Mexico and the world a lot of times. And I don't really believe on that, because it's also as the financial crisis. When you take like outside and reflect and really understand not being really close, you understand that our cycles and that eventually everything will be okay. So that's my view on the Mexican election.
You know, I would say that based on my experience in Mexico, Mexico will always slouch towards oblivion, but never quite reach it. Mexicans have an amazing genius for reinvention and for surviving. If you live in Mexico City, that place should not work. They have to pipe water uphill. There shouldn't, when you turn a faucet on, it shouldn't come out. It somehow does. It's an amazing entrepreneurialism. And life is, you know, if you've got money, Mexico City is marvelous. If you don't have money, Mexico City is a tough place to live. But across Mexico, it's one of the things I admire most. There is in self-criticism, Mexicans will say, que burrada, you're like just being a dumb burro kind of going through the motions. But, I'm 62 now. Just keeping going, that's actually pretty good for most societies. And I actually do agree with what Alejandro said. I am not worried about June 2nd. I honestly do think that with all of the stress that the INE, the National Electoral Institute, is under, with the stress on journalism, I do believe that Mexico will hold a free, fair, and transparent election. And I do believe that, as Alejandro said, that Claudia Sheinbaum, the officialdom's candidate, right, for Morena, I do believe that she will win. What I think is going to be, for both U.S. policy and for my own particular interest in Mexico, a lot more interesting will be in October, and that's when the new Congress will be set. And just, as a small d Democrat, I kind of like divided government. I think that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I think that I would be worried if anybody had a full run like that. And if you take a look at what Andrés Manuel López Obrador has recently done with a package of 20 constitutional changes that he won't get through now, but he's seeding the ground for when his dedazo, when the woman that he sort of personally picked, and he did personally pick her. I mean, they said they had a referendum. That's one of the things that's kind of a joke about, and when I say democratic institutions are under siege in Mexico by AMLO, I mean, that whole popular referendum thing was a joke, and we all knew it. But I think that she, given her personality, and what Alejandro and I couldn't agree more, she's almost robotic in certain things, which is going to be fascinating if she wins, because Mexicans like to see a president that is kind of in touch with them. And this guy is the current president is the most successful retail politician of the modern Mexican era. His popularity is genuine, and he spent 12 years campaigning, 2 sexennios, 2 6-year periods when he didn't win, campaigning for this job. The big question for me is going to be, and Isabel and I were talking about this earlier, will he leave the scene? Will he remain her shadow? Will he attempt to govern, tras bastidores, behind the scene? Is he going to try to be the power behind the throne? And I think that's an open debate. I really do. I think there are, and far be it for me to say I could look into the soul of Andrés Manuel López Obrador and figure out what the peje is thinking. But I think the likely bet is he's going to try to stick around, and he's going to try to influence things. He's going to try to make sure that nobody investigates the corruption in his family. And I think that sooner or later she's going to get tired of it if she wins.
I couldn't agree more with everything, but with the last thing that you said, because you don't share power. And once she's on power, and after maybe 6 months or 1 year, and with all the troubles of security and everything, and if it happens that President López Obrador starts saying, you should do this, you should do that, eventually we will see a moment in which she breaks and say, well, now I'm in power, I'm taking all the hits. So it's going to be really interesting what happens there at that moment, though. And it will also depend if they have majority or not, because then she will need it more or not, because once he leaves the office, he's going to still be very popular with 20 million people following him. So that's going to be a really interesting dynamic.
El tiempo dirá what happens. Another question.
So with regards to Claudia, when she takes power, do you think she will continue some of the policies, or she will try to continue some of the policies for dismantling the democratic institutions in Mexico? And I was going to say, when the DEA goes and arrests and does one of those surprises ambushes, it is mostly Mexicans rooting for them, okay? So we like those surprises and would like to see a lot more of those surprises, okay?
I think Sheinbaum candidate, she's more ideological from the left, because our current president, it's like something strange. Yeah, because, I mean, supposedly people from left really supports ecological policies. Actual president doesn't. They doesn't like very much military. Actual president love military. So it's like strange, no? But talking about the candidate, I think she's more ideological, true left, but she's technical. And I think she will continue for sure the social programs, for sure. All of the candidates will continue that. But I think the judicial programs and all those type of things, she's not going to maintain that. Because she doesn't, I think she doesn't believe on that. But she has to say okay now, because if not, she will lose the career. I think she's much more a modern left than where we are looking now in our actual president.
Yeah, I would just comment that I agree completely. I think between now and June, you're not going to see any daylight between her, y 4T, you know, the fourth transformation. She's going to toe the line absolutely right up until the day if she wins. What she does after that, I think, will be a very slow. I don't think she's going to make any precipitous decisions. I think she is, you know, she's a scientist, right? So she's going to look at data. She's going to see what's working. I think one of the things she's going to find is that what AMLO has done, he's taken a number of programs and turned them into cash transfers. So in a bizarre way, right, he's the ultimate Republican, right? Get big government out of the way. We don't need to do service delivery. I'm just going to give you cash, and you, average Mexican citizen, you go and take this cash and you make the best decisions for your life. And my own personal view is that may work for a few things, but for most things, it doesn't work, because people don't take that money and use it for the purpose for which they've been given. If you look at school programs for kids, right? If you just give parents money, it tends to go to pay for the electric. It pays for the broken car. It doesn't always go for keeping the kid in school. There are a whole bunch of other things. I think what she'll do, as you said, she is truly out of Mexico's traditional left wing. She comes out of, you know, the UNAM, the public university mentality of wanting a society that has greater equality. And Mexico right now is one of the most unequal societies in the hemisphere. And that is driven mainly because Mexico has experienced enormous growth in its wealth, but the concentration of that wealth is still in very few hands compared to many societies, say, in Western Europe or even the United States, where, admittedly, we have a growing wealth gap. I think she'll try to address that. Last point real quick on the DEA. I have no problem with the DEA investigating. What I have a problem with them doing is not telling me. I was the chargé d'affaires when Genaro Garcia Luna, meaning the guy in charge because we didn't have an ambassador, when Genaro Garcia Luna was being investigated, when we got the word that a major Mexican narco-trafficker named El Grande, who was actually a 6'6" former cop, so he was well named, said, you know that guy that you're putting all that money into, American taxpayer dollars into, to build up something called the SSP, the new police that he was running? He's been on our payroll for the last 15, 20 years. That should have been reported to the diplomats in charge of the relationship. It wasn't, and that's a structural problem that I believe we Americans have whenever we go and do law enforcement cooperation. I don't say diplomats should ever have a say in who's investigated, how they're investigated, why they're investigated. That should be impartial, and it should be based on the facts. But as a buddy of mine says, if you're going to crash land the aircraft, do me the courtesy inviting me on for the takeoff so that I can try to pick up the pieces better than what we have. Because if I were a Mexican today, I would think one of two things. Those guys sitting in the embassy on Reforma in Mexico City, they're either corrupt and they knew all about the corruption that was ultimately exposed, or they're idiots. And I beg to differ. I'm neither corrupt nor an idiot, but I was kept in the dark. And so that's the problem I have with the DEA. Not the fact that they investigate, not the fact that we go after drug traffickers, but the fact that they don't do it in a whole of government integrated fashion.
And I'm sorry, but talking about what's going to keep you awake for the next president in Mexico, I was thinking, and for sure it's going to be at least these four things. The relation with the ex-president being so popular, the relation with the army being so powerful now, because now Mexican army, it's involved in practically everything in the country. So the relation with the ex-president, the relation with the army, the relation with the states, with US, and security. Those four things are going to be the top agenda of the next president, and for sure it's going to be the biggest challenges they're going to have.
There was one question over here.
Thank you both. I appreciate the comments. With all respect to the AFA and DC, they tend to dominate the conversation. But so I want to bring it back down to Sonora and Arizona. What do you all think is, how can they push diplomacy forward in the bilateral relationship? Thank you.
You know, I used to get this all the time, and it's absolutely true. The criticism from people who live in borderland on the frontier is that you guys in the Chilangos and the Washingtonians, you guys talk about the border, you pass laws about the border, you don't know the border, you don't understand the border. And I spent a lot of time learning the border, learning the differences of the border, just the language that's used on the border. I mean, as you come out towards Arizona, New Mexico, California, you hear the term Anglo. You don't hear that term in Texas. When you think about who administers the border, the customs officials, the immigration officials, they're all, in a large measure, locals. You know, one of the things that makes me always sort of laugh is when I hear my Mexican friends say that when they come across the border, any one of the 48 POE, ports of entry that we have, the worst thing in the world is if they get a Mexican-American CBP official. They hate that. They want me. They want a gringo. They want a real gringo. Why? Because he treats me better. He'll treat me better than if I get a nasty word beginning with P. And so what more can you do? I think that the border communities are some of the most admirable communities that I've ever seen, in the sense of local communities getting together, figuring out what their issues are. And those issues are usually things like sewage in San Diego. They're things like water lines or energy lines that go across, and cross a line in the sand that are essential. I think that you should continue and make those connections, and we have the forums, we have lots of forums, but make those connections and send those people to Washington and Mexico City with a local agenda. What very, very frequent, I'll tell you somebody who's been enormously successful at this in the American political context, and that is Henry Cuellar. He's a congressman from Texas. You don't have a meeting with Cuellar where he doesn't bring it back to his people. So elect officials who are going to take your local issues and inform people like me, people who are not from here, people who didn't grow up on a border.
No more questions? Miguel.
Talking about these top topics for the next president, in the agenda, you mentioned one is the relationship with the United States. How do you think, or maybe how do you wish the next president, which likely it's going to be Claudia Sheinbaum, how do you think she's going to handle the relationship with the United States, considering that López Obrador, in my opinion, has been very anti-American. But thank you, and thank you for all your comments.
Well, I'm not an expert. Ambassador is an expert on those type of things, but my sentido común, how do you say sentido común?
Common sense.
My common sense says it all depends who wins in the States also. If President Trump's win, then for sure I will advise Claudia Sheinbaum to get Marcelo Ebrard as ambassador in Washington, because he has a good relationship with President Trump, and for sure that will be more dynamic and they will understand a little bit better. If President Biden wins, then I think the challenges will be others. But for sure, migration is going to be, in any way or another one, maybe one of the top issues that now it's totally in the polos, and it's either black or white, and I don't believe on that. I think life it's full of grays, and it's not black and white. So I think it all depends who's going to win and the results that we're going to have on that.
I would simply add that I think that of modern Mexican presidents, the one who has been the most successful in figuring out how to manage an American president was Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Donald Trump. These are two guys, if you remember 2 or 3 years before Trump won, he wrote a book about him, trashing the guy, hey Trump, and his whole history, AMLO's whole history, was a Mexican nationalist, con agallas. I mean, he was tough and loved to bash the United States. I mean, it was a standard cantaleta. And as soon as Trump comes in, what did he figure out? He figures out this guy couldn't care less about democracy in Mexico. He couldn't care less about a thriving journalism. He certainly doesn't care about our issues with income disparity. All he cares about is a transactional relationship on the border. And he got elected by telling Americans that he was going to build a wall and we were going to pay for it. So you would think that the first thing that AMLO would have done would have been to make fun of him, to get up in his face and burlarse del gringo. Yeah, who's going to pay? We're not going to pay for your wall. He didn't. He played it beautifully, and he was an extremely transactional president with Trump. And in many ways, I think that, if you think about the term, the tail wagging the dog, right? In terms of absolute power, the United States is much more powerful than Mexico, militarily, economically, however you want to measure power, right? And yet, it was the asymmetric, less powerful partner in the relationship who could move Trump by simply saying, oh, you want to do a third country thing? Yeah, we'll do that. But make sure you say nothing about what I'm doing internally. So what did he do? He took the military, right? And now you have the National Guard in Mexico. And he militarized so many functions in Mexico that should not be in the hands of uniformed military. And what did the Americans do? They said nothing, made no noise. And I think he's continued that to a certain extent with Biden, because I think that Biden, when he came in, appropriately in my view, recognized our border policy is anathema. Separating families is a violation of human rights. We cannot do this. And so what he did was kind of the Newtonian equal and opposite reaction. He tried to undo everything that Trump had done on the border in the first several months through executive orders. And so there sits El Peje, right, Manuel López Obrador. He says, beautiful, I can figure out this guy. And he's played it exceptionally well. I think overall to the detriment of the bilateral relationship, because I think that genuine partners should be more interested in each other's prosperity. I'm not saying they should get involved in strictly domestic issues, but we have a lot of issues that are what we call in Washington intermestic. they're not strictly. In Mexico, it's not an international affairs portfolio. Colin Powell used to tell me that. He used to laugh and he would say, Mexico, that's domestic affairs from the U.S. perspective. So I think that the issue of how Claudia Sheinbaum, if she wins, how she'll handle the United States is going to be one of the most important issues that I think will affect all of you here on the border.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Alejandro. Special thanks to Mia and Sam for their hard work putting this event together, and thank you all for coming. Buenas noches.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.